Victor Davis Hanson, the name Mexifornia comes from what?
Actually, it's a term that I discovered that was used by sort of the La Raza left, that was a connotation for a new hybrid culture in California that would be not part of Mexico, not part of the United States. So the editors that I worked with embraced that as a title, but a lot of people think it came from the conservative right, but actually it didn't.
Who's La Raza?
It's a term, very funny word. It means the race. There's a National Council of La Raza that's an advocacy group from people they claim of Mexican heritage. But I'm very worried about that nomenclature because it reminds me of the connotations of Das Volk. Anytime you have a word for the people, but it really means the race, I think it's outside the boundaries of the American assimilationist experience.
What's a classics professor writing a book about Mexifornia?
I don't know. Sometimes I wish I hadn't have written it. But I actually live on a farm in Central California, and I am a fifth generation. I live with Mexican-American people. My daughter's boyfriends are Mexican-American. I have a brother married to a Mexican-American, step-nephews and nieces. So it was sort of a memoir, a literary memoir of what I grew up with, and it was prompted by the idea that I thought that the world that I used to know of assimilation and second and third generation Mexican Americans were such wonderful citizens that this new generation was not getting the same opportunities, and I was worried about some of the problems looming ahead for the future of California.
You said you're not sure you're glad you wrote the book. Why?
Well, because it's a very strange thing that's happening. We have the corporate conservative right who wants a perennial supply, I think, of cheap labor, who is in alliance with the therapeutic left that wants an unassimilated constituency. And the language that we use, protectionist or racist, precludes discussion of this issue, which is, we have an election coming up in California, a bizarre election, but we have this 800-pound gorilla of illegal immigration. It doesn't have anything to do with Mexicans or Mexico or legal immigration. It's a particular illegal immigration from Mexico that's starting a whole series of inconsistencies, antitheses, problems, and we're not discussing it.
What are the numbers?
Well, we don't know. Nationwide, I think the U.S. Census suggests there's 9 million illegal aliens. I've seen figures of 15 or 19, 20 that advocates from both left and right will use that are currently in the United States. In California, I've seen as many as 3 to 4 million. A term that's used now is immigrants, meaning people were born in Mexico, and that precludes the argument whether they're here illegally or legally. But whatever the term we use, it's a radical shift from, say, 1970, where we had 400,000, not 4 million, and most of them were here legally, and we had the assimilationist pattern where we had no bilingual education, no Chicano studies, and it was based on assimilation, intermarriage, unity of the United States. And I grew up in that generation, and the people that I knew, I was one of the few non-Mexican Americans in my school district. They're all smashing successes now.
There was one point in your book where you talk about where people invoked the Chicano name to you, used it, and you turned on them and said, and you used the characterize yourself as white. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
I've had students that have come out of sort of this therapeutic classes in Chicano studies that will be in my class, and they'll sort of give prerequisites for their questions on Greek history or humanities or Western civilization. They'll say, as a Chicana, I want to say, and this self-nomenclature, and I've sometimes said, do you know where that leads to? It leads to Rwanda, it leads to the Balkans, it leads to historically really disturbing things. How would you like it if I said, as a professor of classics, as a white person, or as an Anglo, or as a Swede? So we really want to get away from that. And when you do that and try to remind students that just because their professor suggested that's a way of expressing ethnic pride, that historically it has a bad landscape around it, it works.
You seem to be, I don't want to use a psychological term, but you seem to be mixed on the way you feel. At one page I'm getting a story about how close you are to the Mexican-American community and they're your friends, and the next page you lay out some rather strong stories about the downside of it all.
Yeah, well, I think the issue can be explained that Mexican-American heritage is very valuable. It's the best, I think some of the best, I have to say that because those are the people I know and I like and I grew up with. I didn't really grow up with people who were not Mexican American in to any large degree, or some of the best citizens, and that's where the tragedy starts to entail. After 1970, we suddenly felt the market doesn't work anymore. You used to attract workers by raising wages. Instead, the idea was that people will not work, so we need people to come from Mexico. We used to assimilate people by teaching them English. Suddenly we have bilingual education. We have driver's license that the governor's going to sign. So we had all this alternate world of jurisprudence, bilingual education. The result of it was we're starting to see apartheid communities that resemble sort of communities in Mexico rather than the United States. Where I live, Parlier, Orange Cove, Mendota, they're almost 100% immigrants, people who were born in Mexico, and they are not visited by so-called elite representatives of those constituencies in Fresno. People came from Mexico and sort of voted with their feet to embrace a culture. They did not go en masse to Argentina or Brazil or Nicaragua or Chile. They made the decision to leave Oaxaca or Chiapas or central Mexico because Mexico could not provide goods and services to service their population, and they wanted a different type of social, economic, political landscape or structure, and they found it in California, and they wouldn't be so silly or naive to romanticize a culture that gave them nothing and to reject a culture that's given them everything. We've also created in California this aristocratic lifestyle for upper middle class Californians that would be not possible elsewhere. We have literally millions of Californians whose lawns are cut by people who are here illegally from Mexico, whose children are watched, whose houses are cleaned. But the problem with that is that these people don't just fly to Mars as they would assume. Given the wages that they get and given the status of which they enjoy, which they can't participate in the civic life of California, then we have to do something to give them the advantages that we do, and that means entitlements. And we have a $38 billion deficit right now on an annual basis, and we're starting to see the wages of that. There's a cycle that's very disturbing we don't want to talk about. Somebody comes from 18 from Mexico, say from Oaxaca, very young, robust male, happy. We give him $10 an hour to pour concrete. He says, this is 10 times more than I make in Mexico. Everybody's happy. But then suddenly we're surprised when he would want to marry, have 3 children, and get on his knees for 10 years. A knee goes out, a back goes out, an elbow goes out, and then what happens? These are no longer rite of passage jobs. Our children don't do them anymore. They're not considered a stepping stone while you learn English and gain education, but they become a perpetual job. And then when you're 50 and you're hurt and you have a family, then your children who have never been to Mexico don't feel that America was such a great deal. They have no method of comparison, but they do see that their children, their parents work for somebody far more affluent, and you get a range of bitterness. We have problems with graduation rates in high school. 4 out of 10 Mexican immigrants are not graduating. Children of Mexican immigrants, we're having a problem with bachelor's degree, only 7%. And the employer then looks at this phenomenon and says, well, don't bring somebody out who has a tattoo. Don't bring somebody out to the crew who speaks English. I want somebody from Oaxaca who's a hard worker. So we just cycle people as if they're commodities. And it's really amoral, and we don't want to discuss it, left or right.
You referred as examples of newspaper stories that are in the local Fresno paper, yes. Fresno Bee. The first one, I'll read it. It says, a young alien ran a red light, hit my truck, and attempted to flee before I called the police on my cell phone. He had no identification, registration, or insurance, and was clearly intoxicated.
Yes.
What's your point?
Well, when I drive into Selma, a local town, if somebody hits me and they're illegal, then we go through the normal processes of adjudication, law enforcement, insurance. But if somebody hits you and they're here illegally from Mexico and they don't speak English and their car is not registered and they don't have a driver's license, then they're going to be afraid that when the police arrive, they might be deported, even though they probably won't be. But so what happens? They leave the car by the side of the road, which usually was bought for cash. It's used, it doesn't have very much value, and then you go to your insurer and have to pay for it. That's happened to me with people leaving the road and tearing out vines or trees. You hear this enormous crash, you go out and then you see a car and the driver's usually gone. The vines serve as a cushion, they're usually not hurt. They've torn out 20 vines or so, and then you're stuck with replaying the vines, waiting 3 years for them to come into production, probably a $20,000 loss. The car is there, Highway Patrol comes out, says there's no registration, there's no proof of insurance, the driver's gone, and they haul the car away. And that happens, that's a routine fact of life in Central California.
What did you mean by the elites don't understand that consensual government is rare in the history of civilization?
Well,
and who's an elite?
Yeah.
Define.
Well,
aren't you an elite?
Yeah, I am in some ways, absolutely. What I mean by an elite is usually a person who's got a bachelor's or advanced degree. They usually are in the upper middle class, if you define that by income, and they usually don't have to toil on their knees or their back, or they're not doing manual labor for very little money. And in that way of thinking, that's what would constitute an elite. What I meant in that context is that we fail to inculcate to people who come from Mexico that the United States is unique, the Constitution is unique, it's part of a Western tradition of secularism, rationalism, consensual government, open markets, the respect for the law, civic audit, and independent judiciary. And when you add all of those factors together, it explains why a wealthy country like the United States is prosperous and can attract people, whereas in the case of Mexico, if you go across the border to Mexico, they have wonderful farmland, they have oil, they have natural gas, they have good climate, but the paradigm is not similar, and therefore it cannot feed and clothe and house its 100 million people to the same degree that we can in the United States, and people recognize that at a very gut level, and they vote with their feet to come north. That being said, it seems to me that we who are an elite, who are educated, and understand that process not only in the concrete but in the abstract, have a special duty to tell the immigrant this is why, to, I guess, reify or to articulate why they came across. You came across, and this is why, and this is what we're going to do to make sure you're a success. Whereas if we do the opposite and say that our culture is no different than yours, or this was really your homeland, or you really don't need legal status, or English is just as no better or no worse than Spanish, or any of these issues that we often communicate, then we're failing our responsibility. And it's a moral responsibility.